This is a discussion that we've been really anticipating, and so it's wonderful to have all these different perspectives to discuss Emily Kam Kngwarray's work. She really is one of Australia's, is the greatest Australian artist. She really does inspire so much emotion. People get very excited looking at her work. It really does do something to people. This exhibition is incredibly special. The number of works really skip across her 8-year career. And it's wonderful to talk to everyone today about her knowledge systems, about country, about what it means to about place and identity. So I'd just like to probably open the discussion with a question for all of you, really to think about Emily's art is really grounded in this reciprocal relationship between people and place. And what does it really mean to each of you to have rights and responsibilities to land, especially from all your own cultural and disciplinary perspectives? Jennifer, would you like to start?
Oh my goodness. I mean, that's quite a complex question when you're living in Archway, you know. So in terms of my relationship to Archway, it's fond, but, you know, not particularly serious or embedded in my psyche. But, you know, more seriously, I'm Australian, and I have a deep connection to my home of Australia, even though I've lived here for a long time. And I think it's been very important getting to know works by artists such as Emily and other First Nations, extraordinary First Nations Australians artists who have really sort of highlighted that a connection to land isn't just a physical one. It's one based in knowledge systems, it's based in history, it's based in memory, it's based in tradition and lawmaking. And so it's a far more profound idea of land than the one that I was brought up with in a sort of a Western family in Australia. So, yeah.
Amanda, would you like to?
I think it's a really fascinating question. I've never been to Australia. I'm unfamiliar with the landscapes that we see around us here today. I think what I find really interesting about it is the disconnection that we have in the UK to land and the questions of responsibility. I think there's lots of incredible questions that come up about connection, stewardship, custodianship, that we have a separation from here. I mean, I live between Glasgow and Strathspey, which is in the Scottish Highlands, and there's some ridiculous percentage. I think there's 50% of rural Scotland is owned by 400 odd groups and individuals or things like that. So there's a very much a disconnection between the land that we live on and in and the people that actually control it and run it and make decisions about it. So I'm really interested in how we start to create ways where we can feel responsible for and take responsibility for in the kind of small and larger ways that we potentially can. And I think certainly I feel a lot more connected to and I have a much more keen responsibility for land in where I stay in the Highlands, where we have a shared well that we have to make sure that doesn't run dry, which has been slightly scary this spring actually. We have a WhatsApp group that monitors fires and puts messages out if there's a fire that nobody knows about and things like that. So there's a lot more kind of connectivity to ideas of responsibility just born from place and where we are and that immediacy of it. And I think like these kind of questions about responsibility in the here and now and where we are, but then how that relates to more distant places where actually we should have that responsibility for. These are the kind of questions I think for me come up in the work we see here, but just kind of generally in that relation to responsibility in the here and now for the future in terms of place and locality, but also beyond that to elsewhere.
Fellow Australian, another Australian, Tamsin, do you have, what's your sense of place? Well, like Jennifer, from Australia, living in the UK, does this come into your thoughts about this particular question?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born on Ngunnawal country. It's an unceded country. There's hundreds of unceded countries in Australia. There's no treaty. These countries have always belonged to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and my ancestors never asked permission to live there. And that discomfort, that growing awareness, is actually what brought me here to London, to ask those questions of how were my ancestors, who are, some of them are Anglo-Celtic, you can probably tell I'm a bit of a mongrel, as we say in Australian parlance. And some of my ancestors were invaded and pushed out through colonial powers and decision-making that happened here in this city. So on one hand, I have that very real awareness of the history of this place and its relation to where I was born. I was really lucky. I grew up in the bush, so Ngunnawal country, that's where the capital city is, Canberra, and I grew up north of Canberra, in the direction of Sydney. It's a very beautiful country. It's dry. It's got lots of tussock, very noisy cockatoos, beautiful fuzzy wombats and kangaroos and wallabies and laughing kookaburras, and that was my childhood. And I think one of the things that's really important about the bush as a teacher is, even though I did not belong to the Ngunnawal peoples, I could see their care of the land and our mismanagement of the land. And I grew up partly, we moved and I grew up in a farming district, and I could see how these Western farming systems were ravaging the land. These were farming systems that didn't make sense to the country. And you can see from the 2020 bushfires what happens with mismanagement of country. I also learnt to respect country. If you're not paying attention, if you're not being fully present and you step on a snake, it'll let you know very quickly. And so it's that sort of wisdom that comes from paying very close attention, from really feeling the weather and how it shifts and how that's going to change your day. And it can be a dangerous country if you don't respect it. And I'm so grateful for that upbringing, and being connected to the National Gallery of Australia, because Emily, Kam Kngwarray and all these amazing artists, the National Gallery of Australia being the closest local gallery, has the largest collection of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander works in the world. So I was able to see the art of the custodians of this country and relate to that from that wisdom.
You've brought up that beautiful point of sensing the land. Like growing up in the bush, I grew up in the city. I really didn't have any real connection to country in that way. And I think for many people, Kngwarray's works kind of make you think about, what it is about country. Like there's something in that is, it's not just a landscape. There's this sensual, there's a sensual country. It's a feeling country, which is really what comes out in her work. Amanda, you work in this way. Would you like to sort of elaborate a bit how your work and maybe how it's kind of aligned in a way, possibly with that concept? Yeah.
I mean, I think what really struck me in seeing Kngwarray's work, but actually seeing the footage of her, was her making work in place. And I think that idea of, I make work about the Highlands, I write about the Highlands in Scotland and nature writing, I write for The Guardian, Country Diary and things like that. But what really strikes me is that just because the nature of my life, it's quite often fleeting, it's moments, it's going in and leaving, and I'm lucky now to live in the Highlands, so for the past 15 years I've been making work in various shapes and forms about a particular place, Abernethy, things like that. But what really struck me about Kngwarray's work is how she sits in place and makes work in place, on place. And that kind of almost surround sound and multisensoriality of where she is and how she makes, it feels like she's hearing the birds, feeling the breeze, feeling the sunshine, smells, all of these things feel to me like a really important part of how you actually capture essences of place. But at the same time, I think she's also pulling in kind of history and almost what we call prehistory to that as well. So there's something about the incredibly holistic view of making, which I think is incredibly important and something that I think very few of us in the UK or that would call ourselves contemporary artists actually have the capacity to do, because our lives don't facilitate that knowledge and that deep knowledge in that way. So I'm very much thinking about the importance of being sedentary. And certainly the only time I've been sedentary was during lockdown. And I was in the Highlands during lockdown, and that for me that was incredible, because I could see when the first swallows of the summer came back. I was there. I could see when they left. I could hear the first cuckoo, I make a note every year of when the cuckoo comes and things like that. And some of my other work has been about language and Old Scots language, and how if you go back and look at 19th century Scots language dictionaries, and I'm sure if you start to speak to people from Yorkshire and across the country, there are so many words related to nature that we've now lost. So, like, for example, I talked about a cuckoo coming. There's a cuckoo flower that blooms round about the time the cuckoo comes, and there's a Scots word called a gowk storm, which is a couple of really stormy days, kind of in April, May, which is round about the time that the gowk, the cuckoo, comes back to Scotland. So there's a real kind of connectivity there that I think we've lost, and I think what's, for me, incredible to see in Kngwarray's work is just how that connectivity is still here, and I would love to find a way to get back to the connectivity. And I'm always curious about the word Indigenous and what that means for us here in the UK. Who are the Indigenous people? Where do they come from? And I'll just finish up by saying, like, what one of the other thing I think fascinating for me, and it'd be lovely to speak to you more about it, is that Scotland was cleared. There's these massive clearances of people in the 17th and 18th centuries, and people were cleared from their land to make way for sheep. But people were cleared from the land, and then they went to Australia, and then did the same kind of thing that happened to them. And there's something about that, connections and disconnections, but also just how we have to start to look globally to understand these small kind of local things that kind of have happened. So I feel like I've gone off on a waffle there, but you can see where I'm maybe trying. It is. I think what's fascinating is the more you start to think about connections, they just spin out, and there's more and more and more to make.
Well, with that connectivity, when you're talking about hearing the first cuckoo and the seasons, which is incredibly important, relating back to Kngwarray's work. So there's not just 4 seasons, there's many seasons in the desert. And Kngwarray was incredibly attuned to this, and she knew her country. It was a part of her identity. And so this way that she would paint would also, the colours that she would choose was very aligned with what the seasons, what was happening, whether it was dry, whether the rains were imminent, in this ritualistic way. And Jennifer, you've written this is how do you think about you've explored how women's art is frequently embedded in ritual and these non-linear forms of knowledge. So how might you think we read Kngwarray's work as part of that lineage, both local and global?
I mean, that's a big question, but I think, at the core of it, what her work embodies and represents in a way, apart from its extraordinary beauty and wisdom, is that it represents a real challenge to the Western art historical canon. The idea that only certain kinds of making art, ways of making art in certain parts of the world by certain kinds of people were considered valid for the art historical canon. And obviously that's been blown apart, with extraordinary work like this, where she is exploring simultaneously ancient knowledge forms and also her place in modernity. I mean, she's a woman who's reflecting on what it means to live at that point in time, at this place in time. And she also is sort of emblematic, really, of so many women across the world who were excluded from a kind of a serious assessment of their work, or as seen as part of an art historical narrative, because they were involved in various forms of spiritualism or various forms of art making that weren't seen to be part of a sort of a linear elitist modernity. So, in that sense, what I see here is an amazing celebration of the idea that the art historical canon isn't something carved in stone. It's something that is constantly being remade and reformed and adapting to different geographies and different ways of thinking. And in that sense, it's very exciting, that this monolithic art history that seemed impermeable to people who weren't deemed appropriate is now being cracked open, and lights are coming, different forms of light are coming in. So.
Yes. And Kngwarray really was a pioneer. She really was. She was the first. She really did crack open. She led the way for many women in the desert, but also in the cities. She really it wasn't men's business anymore. It wasn't a men's practice. And so she really, she's still pioneering to this day. To have this exhibition here, the exhibition at Tate, it really is Kngwarray, to do that, which is, really quite extraordinary. So I think thinking about women's knowledge systems as well. This is to all of you. So how do you think we should begin to think through like the cultural and ethical and aesthetic implications of women's ceremonial knowledge, which is really what Emily was connected to when she was painting. It was the song, it was the dance, it was body paint, it was increased ceremony. So moving from this private ritual or women's business into this public display. So what are your thoughts on this and in this way? Tamsin?
There's so much to say about that. We're so lucky, we're so privileged to be able to sit here and look at all these beautiful paintings. I see these as such an offering to us of her love of her country and the knowledge systems that she was a custodian of as an elder, as a keeper of women's ceremony. And for her, she didn't really offer that many interviews during her life. There's this one quote that's shared again and again where she says, these paintings are everything. She doesn't see a delineation between women's ceremony and yams that form the core of her name. She doesn't see a difference between the country that she worked on, nor the animals that lived there, or herself, or her kin, and the kinship systems that were involved. They're all there in her painting. So this segregation, the categorization that those of us who went to Western informed universities, we've had to unlearn that and learn a different way of thinking in order to even begin to approach her work. And I wonder sometimes when I'm looking at these works, is the reason why we feel such astonishment at her use of colour and understanding is she just loved her country so much. And I use the word her country because I think she wouldn't have said it was hers. I think she would have said she belonged to it. Like that the country is everything for her. And so I find it really, really beautiful and astonishing just seeing these extraordinary works. I mean, just to give you a little bit more context, as a keeper of those beautiful women's ceremonies, they literally painted country onto the body, and those would be the stories, the song lines, and then they would perform those ceremonies, and then she's translated those markings, those patterns, onto first batik, which you can see downstairs, and Indonesian batik. Oh, there's a whole exhibition that needs to come from that, but. Indonesian batik was brought to the art centre that she worked at, and the women who were part of her community, they always said that she had such a distinct way of translating the ceremonial body painting, that she was always like the outline. And then she was given these canvases. What she's doing here is responding to the scale of modernism and postmodernism. So you can see these earlier paintings here, and then you can see how she's going grand in response to a contemporary art world. So even though she's very much rooted in her own culture and country, she's then translating it into a language that we might begin to touch and also experience that wonder and that incredible, sincere, intergenerational, all-time consuming love that is between her and her kin and country.
The question has been asked. So, did she see her works once they were painted, and did she, did she see them in galleries, or what happened? But really, the painting, the ritualistic, the performativity of her painting, which she would paint, extraordinary, like huge canvases within 2 days. Many of these works were done in a day, and that's because it was. The act of painting was just in the now. It was this performativity. When it was finished, she would walk away and it was done. But what she was sharing was her love, as Tamsin, as you said, like her love of country. She wanted to share her country with people. And so she felt, and because that her success, which she did have in life, so immediately she was successful, she believed that the success, why she was so successful is because people, because her country was so beautiful, and that people were understanding her country, which is really quite beautiful. But this idea of seasonality and temporality, I think, is really interesting. Jennifer, did you want to talk more about the difference in her works? Like, I mean, how do you sort of read these stylistic shifts? How do you sort of read them? I guess.
I mean, it's a very complex question in a way, because every person looking at every work of art in the world brings their own history to looking at it, despite whatever the artists themselves intended with it. So on the one hand, I can look at these as extraordinary, inventive, playful, rhythmic, gorgeous immersions in color and line that are very restless in the way she's using her language. She's constantly changing and constantly challenging herself. But on the other hand, of course, when I look at these, I realize that they're informed by a knowledge system that I can only understand from a great distance, in a way. And what really struck me when I've looked at pictures of Emily painting, and, that all of these were painted on the ground, that they're not painted upright, that she's sitting like within the canvases, especially the really big ones, and she's creating these worlds around her. And I think that what's really astonishing about the way she made these works, and in terms of, what Tamsin was talking about too, it's this idea that she's not really representing country. She's almost bringing country onto the canvas and having a deep immersion in country. And so that's a very different approach from, say, an artist making work in America or France. It's a different kind of understanding of where you're from, and a different philosophical and almost legal connection to country, in terms of like that this was hers. She owned this. It owned her. So, I think that there are so many different ways of looking at this work, and the more you look at it, the deeper it becomes.
I think it's a really important point. I think we were just discussing earlier, you were saying you're a bit hesitant maybe to talk about Australian First Nations work, and so really this, but the conversations that we're having, these works are made to be seen, to be connected with. This was absolutely, the point. And of course, an understanding, or is claiming to be an authority on Indigenous knowledge systems and ontology, absolutely not. But her work does activate something in a way of understanding the land that she came from. Tamsin, in your curatorial work, so how have you approached this challenge of making space for Indigenous temporalities and these sort of embodied practices, within your work?
So one of the projects that I worked on whilst I was at Tate, it was one of those pandemic wonders, was an exhibition that was based on Tate's collection, and some of those works were co-owned with the MCA, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Australia in Sydney. But we had a series of works from this period in Emily Kam Kngwarray's practice. Curation is so much about translation. And what was really important about that exhibition, and what I loved about working on it, was we worked very closely with the senior curator at the MCA, and her name's Chloe Bullen, and the mentorship and the friendship that actually came from that experience was so important. None of us here can speak to that experience. And I think I mentioned to you before, one of the things that I loved the most was Chloe came up with this beautiful language about explaining what connection to country is. And I tried to put together some language based on research that I'd done, but she just put it very frankly. She said, connection to country is everything. It's where law comes from, it's where stories come from, it's history, it's kinship. The country is part of the family, and all the knowledge systems, all art, everything that they know, all language, everything comes from the land. And I'm sure I've paraphrased it brutally, because just, you could tell her own profound connection to country. And, coming in, I feel very lucky that I've had that experience growing up in a country that's wrestling with these questions of how do we, those of us who can't possibly relate to this experience, this connection to country, how do we touch on that? And with Chloe, it's really important to make sure that we're in a collaborative role, and that we examine how the museum often replicates colonial violence, the categorizations, the belief in the white, neutral space, and, all the things, the history of collecting, which so many of us know about. And so how do we unpack that? And so much of it is about empathy. It's about sharing those stories that we might be able to attach to. I mean, so many of us have a special place, and what makes that special place, or many special places, is often because of the love we have of that place. It might be because of the environment. It might be because of something extraordinary that happened there. And so sometimes when I'm trying to think about it, I'm trying to imagine, what would it be like to have 65,000 plus years of those sorts of stories and love and wonder and knowledge. And that's only how I can begin to touch on that. Like, if we can think that Stonehenge is 5,000 years old and then multiply that, then we might begin to understand how deep and profound that must be. And I'm just kind of in awe of it. And I think making space for that is somewhere between, paying really close attention to the work, spending time with the work, trying to understand what is it that she's trying to share with us. These works here, these early works, they were before she was given raw canvas. So these were pre-stretched, and you'll see on the side she's she's painted these lines. And so these lines are also used in women's ceremony, but we've also learnt that they represent the seeds that are in the ground that bloom after the rains. When Tate had one of these works before we realised it, someone had reframed it and put the lines flat. So they'd flatten the whole canvas. And what we did is we re-stretched the canvas to retain that that integrity of her initial intent, and that was due to the wisdom of Matthew Gale, who was the head of the collections, and he really understood how to be sensitive to the work, the history of the object. And so there's so much collaboration that's involved in trying to show this. And yeah, I mean, those are some of the ways.
Curation is so important, and there's a wonderful example of that. Amanda and I we did a walk before downstairs. If you haven't gone downstairs, the batiks are hanging in this way where you made this wonderful comment. Amanda, you were saying, there's this real sense of, there's this kind of communal sense when you walk in there. You're sort of embraced by these batiks, which is absolutely speaks to this batik practice that Emily engaged in with for 10 years before she painted on canvas. This women's batik group, there were 80 women. It was a social activity. They were introduced to this method in the early 70s, and they produced these beautiful, beautiful silks. But it was a very collective, communal exercise where the women would get together and they'd boil up, make fires and boil up the drums, and this is, where Kngwarray's practice started. And yes, in works like this, you can see elements of that, particularly this work here with these beautiful sort of roundels. You can see that in this early 1987 batik downstairs. But Amanda, you felt that. Did you want to talk a bit of that experience?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think the batiks in particular downstairs and the way they're hung, you have that feeling of community. And I think what, for me in Kngwarray's work and more generally, there's a real sense of generosity. You might not know country, you might not understand, nor should you necessarily understand ceremony. Nonetheless, there's an openness and there's a real kind of, I suppose, a humanity that connects us to the work. And I think what really struck me was the batiks downstairs, certainly the way they're hung. It's very difficult to look at one in isolation. You're looking at one and then you're seeing another one. So you get that sense of a shared space in which, even if they were, and I think that there's a lovely questions of kind of temporality and how that's looked at kind of throughout the whole exhibition. But even though the batiks downstairs are created over different time periods, there's something about the connectivity that really makes you understand the importance of community in the work. And I think that's something that you get when you look at the work in real life too. Like I spent a lovely morning with you and, just and a lot of time on my own, just going around and really, really looking at the work and how carefully it invites you to look. And and I think there's something about the going in and looking kind of very closely at pieces and stepping away, and there's something I think about that, the space and time that the work invites you to slow down and think. And I think that's a really important part of how we start to look at the work as well. And I'm curious actually about, like I've been to blockbuster shows in the Tate before, and you're jostling for space. But there was something for me, and I would really ask everybody to come back when the gallery's quiet and just take time. And if you can just stand and have time in front of the works on your own, there's something incredible about what you see. And that kind of invitation to slow down, I think, is a really important part of exhibitions like this.
Yeah. No, it is really important. And also that room in particular downstairs, that really, really sort of replicates this sort of that sense of community. But the women that surrounded Emily, she was not alone. She was never painting alone, and so she had always, she was in a group, and she was always together. Though it was very, very, she always had people with her. But then yet she's isolated as this genius, which is usually, in this realm that's reserved for men. So. Jennifer, I just wanted to sort of, see what you think about that. She's isolated from this kind of, in this way, like she's quite a singular artist, but is this sort of in conflict to what, she...
I mean, as I mentioned before, I think that art history is undergoing a big reevaluation of how we think about artists and communities and the idea of individual genius. When you look at a lot the stories of many artists, and they're never as simple as the history books might make out. Even relationships to spirituality, and not just female spirituality, but also male spirituality. I think there's an acknowledgement now that as soon as you start sort of lumping artists together and assuming that they're one thing, that will always be contradicted by the reality of the situation. I mean, we can even turn that around and look at, say, the history of abstract expressionism in America. And often a lot of those artists are pulled together as if they're one thing. And you look at the differences between them and also their different spiritual practices. Jackson Pollock was really into theosophy. Agnes Martin was a Buddhist. Robert Rauschenberg was obsessed with the ideas of alchemy and hidden knowledge. So within all of these sort of monolithic readings of very complex practices, there are always going to be differences. And I do think that that's something now with sort of a great reevaluation of formally accepted art historical narratives, these things are changing. Because, and especially, there's been a great evaluation of the mass exclusions of that art historical canon. Galleries, museums, collectors, everyone is looking far more now at, say, the work of women artists. And many of those women worked within communities. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you know the work of, say, Hilma F. Klint. She's another, I think, a really important artist in terms of making a sort of cataclysmic, wonderfully, that's meant to be a positive word, shift in these narratives. And she was working with her community. She had a deep connection to land. She was working, it's now considered that many of her great works, such as the 10 largest, were made by other women as well, that she was working with women around her. So, I think art history is a messy thing. It's not a precise science, and the way it's being told should be messy in a way and should acknowledge difference. And it's that difference that pulls us together, paradoxically. Yeah.
Amanda, you're nodding. Would you like to?
I mean, I think that's right, and I think also, not being an art historian, I think there's something about not having to label, not having to categorize. What happens when we don't label? What happens when we don't categorize? What happens when we start to see things from other perspectives? I think quite often we'll think about remoteness or distance, but remoteness is relative. Like for me, it's quite remote. Like when people are in the heart of their community, that's the center of the world, and that being able to look at what the different centers of the world are and take them and value them, I think we would be in a lot better position in terms of art, but just generally. I think having these kind of, and I know with I suppose postmodernism, we're supposed to be able to have ways of seeing the world that takes into account different knowledge bases and things like that. But I think we've got an awful lot more to do. And I think when it comes to Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous ways of understanding the world, like worldviews and things like that, there's so much there to learn, and we still have to really take that on board.
I really appreciate what you've both said. And the murkiness of art history and the male genius being so often synonymous with this individualization. And what we see in those photographs of Emily Kam Kngwarray working on sitting on country. You'll see little specks in her work, that's part of country, actually literally entering her work. But she's always surrounded by her kin. They're all having a good goss session whilst they're making. And, her kin are also making alongside her. She was always a bit bewildered as to why it was her that had all the energy when all of these other women that she was painting alongside, they also, many of them had that knowledge too, or were gaining that knowledge. And she was being cared for by her community as well. And there had been those before her who had given her through ceremony the knowledge that she then painted and shared that beautiful love of country. So if we look at any of these male artists, we know that they also had community. Often, women artists who were their partners supporting them, but they were also part of communities. They were also discussing different theories. Like, none of these men were working by themselves. I think what's brilliant about Emily, she reminds us of the truth and dislodges the myths that we've created through art history. And I think exactly what you were saying as well about there's so much more work to do, and I think that's what's constantly beautiful about this very short period of her life. Like, it's like 10 years, right? Like, it's
8 years.
8 years.
Under 10, yeah.
8 years. The last 8 years of her life, that feverish painting, that was her not only loving her country and wanting everyone to know about it, but it's her taking care of her family, not just in terms of the material money that's coming in for her community, but what we're learning a lot about these knowledge keepers and their art practices is they're also it's another way of sharing knowledge. So we might be looking at it from very aesthetic ways and the limited knowledge that we do have. But for those who are initiated, who belong to country and know the stories, they're going to see something completely different from us. And I just think that's so beautiful that there's so many meanings of, so many layers of meaning, as well as layers of paint. And we ourselves are unveiling that for ourselves as we learn more. But I think it would be a mistake to have her as a standalone. Although I do really like that it's the era of the YBAs, and that's all the thing happening here in London. Meanwhile, in the central desert of Australia, she has no idea about that, and she's not really reacting to any movement. She's just working from what she knows. Beautiful.
And I think the other thing we've not talked about as much is actually the multi-species kinship that's part of an inherent part of the work, the kind of more than human aspects, and how that is an inherent part of the work, and that connection to the yam and the emu and the seeds and the seasonalities and the changes that happen, and that kind of absolute attunement to not just human kin but vegetable ecological kin. And I think there's something about I think how we start to think and value things like emotional intelligence, ecological intelligence, all of these different ways of understanding, and that comes from that connectivity to who other people are and what else is happening in the world, and how people different worldviews, I suppose.
There's so much to unpack with her work. We could talk for ages, but feel it's time to open up for questions for any of the panelists. Did you?
Hi, to all of you, I suppose. I was wondering how, since we're in this postmodern era, are you able to exhibit these sorts of works differently to kind of further push these stories that are so different to the westernized style that have existed for so long? Is there a way to more effectively showcase and educate people about something that is so difficult to understand just by glancing?
her works didn't. They come from an ancient place. Like, so the extension of her knowledge. Painting is one arm of this. But these paintings didn't kind of come in isolation. So the Western Desert art movement really opened this up in the early 70s. Emily started painting after that. There was an art market from the very beginning. These works are made to be sold, to be shared, and to be exhibited. And so these weren't sacred objects that have been taken and put into a different context. This is the context that they were meant to be, that are meant to be exhibited in. We were discussing before what her main focus was to share her country. It was important for her to paint. It was important for her, not just for the money, for her family, which she had an extended family. That's absolutely crucial. But she wanted people. She felt that the success of her work that she had in her lifetime was because people were they were appreciating her country. And so the art market, in First Nations Australian art market, isn't very, very long, but it was their market from the very beginning, and it was the way that they wanted it to be, which was so people can still live on their country, they can still speak their language. If there's no language, there's no ceremony. It's an extension of cultural practice, of connectivity, but it is something to be shared. So the visibility of her country is happening now. We're in an incredibly remote place in Australia. So I hope that answers your question.
Actually, may I add something? Because this was a question that we asked ourselves at Tate. How do you position this? And it was really important that we presented a historical moment. So we were looking at the year 1992, which was this extraordinary moment in Australian land rights. It's called the Mabo case, and Eddie Mabo was a Torres Strait Islander, which ironically is the group of islands where Captain Cook first declares that all of Australia is now owned by the British Crown. And he used drawings to prove in High Court, over 10 years, this huge legal battle, that his people have always belonged to their land in the Torres Straits. And the whole country was involved in it. It also, coincided with 200 years since Captain Cook landed. The First Fleet landed in 1788. So they were celebrating it many parts in 1988, but mourning it crucially for a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. So we use that historic moment to try and explain how, where this work fits. That's one way that we were able to show that, in terms of her paintings are also about that historic moment, because her paintings are also part of the land rights movement. And a lot of people in Australia became more interested in Aboriginal art as a result, seeing the rise of this extraordinary Greens movement. Bob Brown leading the first UNESCO listed heritage site, which was an environment, not a built place, and that's in Tasmania. So Australia's consciousness of the land was really transformed. So we really wanted to historicize that. The other thing that was really important was to show language, to remind our visitors who were coming from all over the world that these stories were always told in a language that wasn't English, that they were told in the language of that land. And that was a very tricky thing to take, which as a policy, the interpretation people never have multiple languages. And that's because they want the gallery to be accessible. If you've got something in French, it might assume that someone has a particular class background, that they would then be able to speak French, and therefore they would be able to understand that work. But in this case, we were looking at it from an inverse relationship, that English is the colonial language. So we made sure that the language was in the exhibition as well, for the different artists who have that custodianship of country to be able to share those stories. But even that's problematic because we've got it written down, and most of these languages aren't written. They're oral. So then we've also had video where we could see, for instance, John Morangel speaking in language and speaking to the land. And he's an artist who, instead of working with acrylic on canvas, he was working with ochres and painting on large scale bark. And we were showing these artists to each other and had a huge map of Australia with all the different countries alongside it. And so part of that translation process and displaying these works is also trying to share the knowledge that we've gained thus far, but also acknowledging it's very imperfect, and we've still, humility is so important. Curiosity is really key.
There is a great responsibility still, what Australian First Nations art has to its community in the strengthening of language. And I just want to make the point that from this exhibition, the 10% proceeds will go back to community, will go back to the Utopia community as a contribution to the next generation of artists, to the family members that are practicing today. It is a great responsibility that we really honour, and for people to stay on country, to paint on country, to the intergenerational exchange is absolutely crucial.